Hey guys, welcome back. If you're new here, my name is Becca and today I have Becca's Bookopoly round 25 with a brand new board. So if you guys are unfamiliar at all, Bookopoly is a bookish board game that I play every single month to pick my monthly TBR. I have been running this series for 2 years now. We are entering into year 3 and every year I remake the board. I think about what I've read, how my tastes have changed, how things on the board haven't worked for me, and I rework it with some new spaces and some new challenges. Once again, a big shout out and thank you to Ashley from A Frolic Through Fiction for her help with the art and the text on this board. It is really not my forte and I truly do appreciate her help. If you have never seen a Bookopoly video from me before, then don't worry, because in just a second I will be doing a full tour of this brand new board as well as a recap of the rules. One thing that will be different about this particular episode of Bookopoly is that I will not be doing a recap of last month's rules and whether I completed those books, because new year, new board, new me, and I do give myself December as a little bit of a grace period. It is the only month that I allow myself to fail Bookopoly if I do, which full disclosure I did fail December's Bookopoly and continue on without a punishment. And now it is the time that you guys have all been waiting for, which is a tour of this brand new board. Welcome to the 2021 board. There are quite a few elements in here that are the same or very similar to the last board, and some of them the one before that as well, and there are quite a few things in here that are new. So I'm going to go through this with you. I'm going to be starting off with all of the property spaces all the way around the board, and then we will come back and talk about the rest of the things we have on here. So first off, we have the two browns. These were middle grade and manga slash comic. However, I found that when I was landing on manga slash comic, I was only picking manga and continuing on with the same series. So this time I have split these two down. We don't have middle grade anymore, but I have split it into manga and also comic, because I have enough of both that even if I land on these once a month, I do still own enough to fulfill the challenges. The purples, which are light blue on a traditional Monopoly board, are still fantasy. However, last time they were young adult fantasy. One of the biggest changes with the fantasy sections on this board is that I have removed the demographic, and the reason I have done this is that when I was landing on adult fantasy, which was up here, I was selecting the books that I had to read for read-alongs every single time, which meant that all of the other adult fantasy I wanted to read was getting neglected, and when things like Believeathon roll around, I was struggling to fit in books on my TBR for that because I had no specific section for like middle grade fantasy. So we have 6 fantasy spaces on the board. They are exactly where they were before. We have 3 here and we have 3 up here, all just fantasy with no demographic. This side is the only side that has no explicitly fantasy spaces. So the pinks are now contemporary. However, this does not necessarily just mean contemporary as a genre. It can also mean contemporary as a setting. When I land on fantasy, even though I am able to choose any type of fantasy, I do predominantly choose high fantasy, and so if I wanted to, I could use the contemporary space to read contemporary fantasy, so fantasy that is set in the real world. The oranges are romance. In 2020 I got into romance a lot more. I mainly read fantasy romance, and I can read fantasy romance if I land on these romance spaces. However, I did read a little bit of normal smutty romance, and I read some Colleen Hoover, which is like angsty dramatic romance, and just generally I've really gotten into the romance genre and I would like to read a little bit more of it. On this side we have fantasy for the yellows, as I mentioned previously, and the reds are now science fiction. Science fiction is always a full block on the board. It has moved around quite a bit. I've had it in the greens, I've had it in the oranges, and this year it is on the reds. For the greens we have other, and this is a little bit of an odd section because it pretty much means anything that is not predominantly high fantasy, science fiction or romance. So the books in this section can still have those elements. An example is that I could read a romantic thriller, because a thriller is not any of the genres I just mentioned. However, it does have a romantic element in it. I have a couple of like paranormal dark academia books that have a fantasy element, but they're not necessarily the dominant feature. And of course, as well as that, it could just mean different genres. So a standard thriller, a standard horror. Once again, horror can have fantastical elements in it, but its predominant genre is horror. And then there's also like historical fiction, fabulism, magical realism, and all of that stuff is gathered here because I don't actually read that much of it. I don't own that much of it, but there are a couple of books that I would like to read that fit into categories that are not fantasy, science fiction, or romance. And then finally, the dark blues, we have 2 fan row spaces, which stands for fantasy romance. As I've mentioned, I got quite into fantasy romance in 2020. I love it. It's pretty much all I want to read in the current mood that I'm in. Last year, we just had 1 fantasy romance space on the board, but I do really want to read more of it, especially indie or self-published authors. And so I decided that this year we would have 2 spaces. Now I can read fantasy romance if I land on fantasy, and also if I land on romance, but as it is currently my favorite genre, the genre I'm enjoying reading the most, I thought it could have its own section. Heading back around to the beginning, we will now go through the corner spaces. The first one is of course Go, and this one is almost the same as it was before. In previous years it has been go to Goodreads and randomize your own TBR. Now it is go to own TBR and randomize, so I will be going to my entire own TBR video, randomizing a number, and then whichever number it corresponds to will be the book that I read. Viewer recommends is the same as it always has been. This also utilizes my entire own TBR. However, if I land on viewer recommends, I randomize the comments, and whichever books you guys have said to me that I should read from that video is what I will read if I land here. The other 2 corners are completely different than they have been in previous years. The first one we have is Patreon pick. This is for my inner circle book recommendations jar. Every month I do pick a book from this jar in my TBR video, and this is essentially so there is an extra chance. So if I land on this, I will be pulling an extra book from that jar. And then the final corner we have is pet pick. So if we land on this one, I will be selecting maybe 3 books and seeing which one Hamilton, my cat, decides that I should read. Back around to the beginning again, we have the community shelf and the chant spaces. These are exactly the same as they have always been. The community shelf corresponds to these cards over here. These have a selection of random prompts in them. For example, this one is Instagram recommends, and if I land on that space, I have to pull a card and do whatever the card tells me to. And for the chance cards, we have this deck, and these are a stack of 16 cards, 8 of which I really want to read, 8 of which I am less excited about. Most of the ones I'm less excited about in here are from my These Books Will Self-Destruct in 12 Months video, and if I land on a chance space, I have to read whichever book is on the card I pull from this stack. Next up, we will go through the train station spaces. So last year they were different inspirations of novels. This year they are different reasons why I may be reading a book. So the first one we have is the kind of wild card one, I want to say, the one that's a little bit different from the rest, and this one is Video Project. So if I land on this space, I will be selecting a book that is related to a video I would like to make. So I could read a book that was in a 5-star predictions video, I could read a book for a secret TBR, I could pick a book that I would like to make a completely like separate reading vlog for, or a book that I would like to make a review for, or anything that kind of ties into my channel. The second train station is for review. As you may have guessed, this is for review copies. I don't always have review copies, and I definitely don't usually have a lot of them. However, they do tend to average out at around 1 review copy per month. The next one is Read Along. The little stag on this space is kind of representative of Elder Linglong, which is the read along that my book club Catch Up Book Club are doing, and this space is for books that are for book clubs or read alongs that I'm participating in. I don't think it will get to this, but if I ever land on this when I'm not currently having to read something for a read along or a book club that I'm doing, I will just pick a random other book club or read along and read a book for that. And the final of the train stations is Unhaul. I have teased in a couple of videos that I am going to try to do a unhaul project in 2021 where I read a lot of the books I have on my shelves I don't think I would keep if I read them. Things like young adult contemporaries, thrillers, maybe standalones where I want to see what the hype is about, but I don't think they're going to be my new favorite things. So when I land on this, I will be selecting one of those types of books. So going through and filling in the last few spaces, spaces, we have the 2 tax spaces here. This one is usually luxury tax and this one is usually income tax. So for luxury tax, as usual, I have a most recent purchase. This does not have to be a purchase, it is just the last thing that was added to my collection. So if I am gifted a book, that would count. If I have a review book, that would count, but it has to be the very last book I acquired. And the income tax space is now gifted. This space was previously a library book. With the pandemic, I have currently stopped going to my library because I only went to support them anyway, and with us being in a pandemic and me having a large collection of books, there's really no need for me to go out and do that unnecessarily. So I have put gifted into this space, which was previously in one of the corner spaces. And then I think the final spaces on the board are the electric company, which is here, and the waterworks, which is over here. So the electric company is the same as it has always been, which is ebook or audiobook, just a book that is consumed digitally. And in the waterworks space, we have had quite a bit of a change. This was previously to read one of my mum's books, as my mum passed away in 2018, and waterworks because that was quite an emotional thing for me, just with it being associated with my mum. I have now changed that, and the thing that I replaced it with has very little to do with the waterworks theme. It is to scroll through Goodreads, which is a challenge that I had in my community shelf cards that I really enjoyed doing. So essentially, if I land on this, I will go to my Goodreads update feed, and I have no filters on that at all. Like, I don't have a top friends section or anything. Every Goodreads update goes through my feed. I don't really look at it, I just go there to update my own progress. But when I land on this, I will be going to my Goodreads updates feed and scrolling until I find the first book I own that I have not read. Moving on to the rules, and nothing much is changing this year. Rule number 1 is that every single month I will be doing 5 rolls and adding at least 5 books to my TBR. As per the traditional rules of Bookopoly, if I roll a double, I will have to roll again and add an extra book to my TBR. Rule number 2 is that I must complete my Bookopoly TBR. If I get to the end of the month and I'm filming next month's Bookopoly and I have started the final book on my Bookopoly TBR, then I'm allowed to continue without a punishment. However, if there are any books on my TBR that I have not finished and I have not even started my last book, then I will have to take a punishment prompt from the punishment prompt jar. In here we have 12 bad prompts. If I fail, I have to pull one of these and fulfill it. An example of what is in here, there is one for a big book over 500 pages. There is one where I have to read the book that I last watched a rant review on, and so on and so forth. And rule number 3 is that as this is my TBR and my rules, the spaces on the board are open to my interpretation. As you have just seen, I have made everything a little bit more vague in 2021, just because in some cases I was feeling a little bit penned in, and as my tastes evolve, and they do seem to evolve every single year, I struggle to force my reading into the constraints that I place on myself at the beginning of the year. So a perfect example of how a prompt may be open to my interpretation is that I may land on contemporary and choose to read a contemporary fantasy. I may land on romance and choose to read a fantasy romance. I may land on other and choose to read a thriller that has some paranormal or fantastical elements. But now that we have got all of that out of the way, let us get into our first roll of 2021. Okay, so as it is the start of a new year and new board, we will be starting on go. First roll is a double, and it is a 6. And that is fantasy. And in typical Bookopoly fashion, roll number 1 was a double, so we are already going with a little bit of a longer TBR this year. But roll number 1 was fantasy, which is great because for that I am going to be reading Oathbringer Part 2 by Brandon Sanderson. I was determined to have read this book in December. I'm not even mad that I didn't read this book in December because I had a great time in December with my reading, and also the week that I pretty much read absolutely nothing. But this is the second half of the 3rd book in the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. The Stormlight Archive is one of the series in the Cosmere, and it is an adult epic high fantasy series about this group of legendary knights that have to reform to face the oncoming apocalypse in this big stormy landscape. It is obviously more expansive and way more complex than that, but that is the basics. I have heard that this is Dalinar's book. I'm currently just over halfway through the first half of this, and I can confirm it is very centered on Dalinar, who is one of my favorite characters. witches. I will be reading this because I am one of the hosts for the Stormlight read along. We are very behind schedule. I think we always knew we were going to fall behind, but hopefully the live show for Oathbringer is going to be sometime in January. Roll number 2 is 8. And that is a contemporary. For roll number 2, we landed on contemporary, and for this one I have chosen The Ravens by Cass Morgan and Danielle Page. This is the Illumicrate edition, but the reason that I'm reading this is that I do have an e-arc of it on NetGalley. The release date on this one is the 6th of January, so I am hoping to read this in the first couple of weeks of the month. Now, as we have discussed with how the prompts are open to my interpretation, this one does assumedly have a fantastical element, as this book is about a sorority full of witches. Now, it is debatable how far the witchy aspect, the paranormal fantastical aspect in here is going to extend, as I have read similar books before that are kind of dark academia with a fantastical twist. However, the fantastical twist can be a little bit ambiguous, so yeah, for the contemporary prompt I will be reading this. I haven't read anything from Cass Morgan or Danielle Page before, but a sorority full of witches sounds like something I can get behind. Roll number 3 is a double again, and that is 10. And that is sci-fi. Roll number 3 was another double. We are getting off to a great start in January, aren't we, guys? This one was science fiction, and so I will be reading The Mask Falling by Samantha Shannon. This is an advanced copy that was sent to me by the team over at Bloomsbury, so thank you so much for sending this to me. This is the 4th book in the Bone Season series, which is released on the 26th, I think, of January. And the Bone Season is a series that I really enjoy. It transcends quite a few genres. It is a dystopian, which is a subgenre of science fiction, and then we also have some possible paranormal or science fiction elements in, because it isn't really explained, fantasy as well, and also just like a smidge of romance in there. This book, I wouldn't know what to categorize it as, because it does not have just like one singular genre. In this series we follow a girl called Paige Mahoney, who is a clairvoyant in a world where it is illegal to be clairvoyant. One day when she is catching a train home to stay with her father, the law enforcement see her using her clairvoyant ability, and they eventually catch up with her and take her away to this place. Like, she assumes that she's going to be hanged, but she is instead taken to this place that nobody knows existed, and that just kind of throws open the world in here. We got a lot of political fantasy elements in here, as well as quite a bit of action. Very, very sad in some points, and I think that this is going to be a really sad installment. I've heard that people were destroyed by the end of this, so can't say I'm looking forward to that, but I do really love this series and I am very excited to dive back into this. As well as that, I am a co-host for Bonathon, which was a read-along of this entire series that actually happened at the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, because we thought that The Mask Falling was going to come earlier. However, that is not the case, so while we have already done the bulk of that read-along, we will be coming back together in March to discuss The Mask Falling. Roll number 4 is an 8. And that is other. Roll number 4 was other, and this is the prompt that I asked my patrons to vote on for the month. I gave them 5 options this time, and they were The Wicker King by Kate Ancrum. This is a contemporary with a fantastical element, but then I do believe it also has some thriller vibes, as on the back it is blurbed as a mesmerizing thriller. Next up was Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This is a dark academia / thriller type story that has a paranormal element. Then we have The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. I believe that this one is an adult historical horror. Another adult historical horror was Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Marino Garcia. And the final option was Daisy Jones and the Sixth by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This one is a historical / contemporary style story that is told in a biographical style. And the winner of this month's Patreon poll was The Year of the Witching by Alexis Henderson. So I have heard great things about this, but one of my patrons, Bobby, who has a YouTube channel, I will link it down below, it's Bobby Reads, recommended this to me as she really loved it. But it is a historical horror that takes place in a very religious town, and it follows a young woman who is given the diary of her dead mother by the ghosts of witches. That is all I really know about it, but I have heard some pretty good things. I've heard it's pretty unsettling. It's not like a jump scare horror horror. As far as I'm aware, it is more of a kind of sinister, unsettling kind of horror. But yeah, witchy vibe. So I do have to try it out and I do hope I enjoy it. Roll number 5 is 7, which is fantasy romance. We landed on my favorite space, which is fantasy romance, and there is so much fantasy romance that I want to read, especially after Christmas. But the one that I have gone for my Bookopoly TBR is Kingdom of Flesh and Fire by Jennifer L. Armentrout. I read the first book, which is From Blood and Ash, last month and made a non-spoiler vlog on it. I asked you guys in that vlog whether you wanted me to follow it up with a vlog of Kingdom of Flesh and Fire and whether you wanted it to be spoilery or non-spoilery, and the majority of you guys, I think there was only one person who said they didn't want spoilers, so I will be making a spoiler filled vlog for this book. So this is the sequel to From Blood and Ash, which is a new adult fantasy romance that follows a girl called Poppy who is known as the Maiden. She is never to be looked upon, never to be touched. She isn't allowed to talk to people, and she has to remain this way until her ascension, which will happen when she's 19, and she will be given to the gods. The love interest in here is a god called Hawk who has been tasked with guarding Poppy until her ascension. As you can imagine, things progress between those two because it is a fantasy romance. I do believe, actually, I'm not sure why because I haven't explicitly seen this anywhere, but I have seen some vibes of a possible love triangle in this second book, which I'm not sure how I'm going to feel about that. But I will also be buddy reading this with Kelsey, also known as KJ Sutton, who is the author of one of my favorite fairy romance series, Fortune of Swan, as we buddy read the first book together. And I think that this may be the first book that I finish in the year because I'm real excited to crack on with this. Roll number 6 is 9. And that is fantasy again. For roll number 6, we landed on fantasy yet again, which is always great. And for this one, I'm going to be reading Ship of Destiny by Robin Hobb. This is book 3 in the Live Ship Traders. This is the series that my book club, Catch Up Book Club, is doing a read along of. This book is the last book of the current phase of Elderling Long. In February, I believe, I will be making an announcement video that will lay out the schedule for the next 10 books in the realm of the Elderlings. This series is an adult epic high fantasy that mainly surrounds the Vestrit family. In this book, we have big ships that are made out of wizard wood, and when 3 generations die on the ship does come to life and becomes its own being. We also have sea serpents in here. There is a pirate who would like to be the king of the Pirate Isles, but the pirates don't believe in having kings, so he has set his eyes on a live ship so that he can accomplish his goals. We have a lot of small town politics, as the ships are all from this very small like seaport trading community, and then we have the grander politics as well, some themes of slavery in the outer reaches of the world. And I've absolutely adored this series, so I'm really very excited to continue this, especially as I believe it's going to have some conclusions and reveals about certain characters that have been present in this series so far. If you guys are reading along with us, the live show for this is going to be in early February, and what will hopefully be our final roll number 7, is a 4, which is an ebook. And then our final roll was an ebook. So we had 7 rolls this month, which isn't an ideal start to the year, but I'll take it, I guess. So for this one, I will be reading an e-arc. This one is Captive of Walls by Eva Chase. It was on my extended TBR last month. Sadly, I did not quite get to it. I was so close. It is pretty much the next book that I was going to pick up. But this is a new adult fantasy romance series that follows a girl who has been captured by Fae, and the Fae that have captured her are the same ones that brutalized and murdered her parents, and a new group of Fae, I believe, come and rescue her, and they also keep her in captivity, but like a better captivity than the original ones did. And I also think, because you guys have told me that this contains a reverse harem trope, which I still have not read. I have quite a few books now that have that trope, but I still have not read one, so I don't know how I feel about it. But January is going to be the month that I find out. So that is it for my Bookopoly TBR, and while there are some more books that I would like to read in January. I'm not sure that I'm going to get to them. So there is just one more book that I'm going to be adding to this already 7-book TBR, and that is going to be my Inner Circle Patreon pick. As I mentioned in the tour of the board, this jar has book recommendations from my Inner Circle tier patrons. This has just been refilled as well. I've been doing this for 3 months now, but every 6 months starting from now, if a book from one of my patrons has already been pulled, every 6 months they will get the opportunity to recommend me another book to go in here, and any new patrons who join will be able to recommend a book as soon as they do join that tier. So there is one book in here that I'm actively avoiding, and it is actually in here twice now. I do want to read it actually, it's just that it's very large and I already have 2 very large books on my TBR. I stick my hand in here and it just kind of, I feel like I'm waiting for some divine intervention that just isn't coming. So I guess I'm just gonna go with this one. Ooh, this one is Death in Her Eyes by Erin Bedford, and this one is Ben's recommendation. So I'm just going to grab my phone and have a look what this is actually about, because when Ben recommended this to me, I remember assuming it was a thriller, but apparently it's a fantasy romance. Okay, so I am just going to read the synopsis for you guys, as I have absolutely no idea what this is about. Since she was 4, Elle's life has been nothing but pain and death, so it's not surprising she ended up jaded. When Elle's absentee father kidnaps her from her own mother's funeral, Elle is forcefully enrolled into Fallen Academy, a school for Nephilim like herself. Mind readers, seers, and elementals. Finally, Elle is with other freaks like herself, except Elle soon finds out that even surrounded by her own kind, she might just be too different to fit in. Will Elle find her place among the other children of the Fallen, or does her father have plans of his own? This is only 190 pages. Thank you so much, Ben. So this seems like a young adult, maybe? Paranormal romance. It only has 194 ratings, but the average rating on Goodreads is 4.38 and is hella short, so I'm really excited for that one, and thank you so much to Ben for recommending it to me. So I think that this is it for my TBR. Like I mentioned, there are a couple of books that I would like to read if I get time, but I'm going to try not to stress about them too much and just focus on getting this stack done, plus Death in Her Eyes and also Captive of Wolves, which I will be reading. I'll definitely be reading Captive of Wolves in ebook form, and probably Death in Her Eyes as well. This does look like a pretty intimidating stack, but page count wise it only comes in at like 4,010 pages, which is still more than I do in a typical month. My typical month is about 3,400 to 3,700, but 4,000 is definitely achievable. So yeah, I'm a little bit shocked, I'm a little bit surprised, but hopefully we will be starting off the year with a success as opposed to a failure. So that is it for this month's Bookopoly. Please let me know down in the comments what you guys think of the new board, and also whether you've read any of the books I'm going to be reading this month and what you guys thought of them. Aside from that, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, Instagram and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish body butter and candle website, the Instagram for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you will go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.